This is Chapter 5, the second part of it, starting on page 51 at the bottom. The first to go was Dub. Poor blundering thief that he was, always getting caught and punished, he'd nonetheless been a faithful worker. His wretched shoulder blade, untreated and unrested, went from bad to worse till finally Hal shot him with a big Colt revolver. It's a saying of the country that an outside dog starves to death on the ration of a husky, so 6 outside dogs under Buck could do no less than die on half the ration of a husky. Newfoundland went first, followed by the 3 short-haired porters, 2 mongrels hanging more grittily on to life, but going in the end. By this time all the amenities and gentleness of the Southland had fallen away from the 3 people. Shorn of its glamour and romance, Arctic travel had become to them a reality too harsh for manhood and womanhood. Mercedes ceased weeping over the dogs, being too occupied with weeping over herself, fighting with her brother and husband. To quarrel was one thing, they were never too weary to do it. Their irritability rose out of their misery, increased with it, doubled it, and outdistanced it. The wonderful patience of the trail which comes to men who toil hard and suffer sore, remain sweet of speech and kindly, did not come to these 2 men and women. They had no inkling of such a patience. They were stiff and in pain. Muscles ached, bones ached, their very hearts ached. Because of this became sharp of speech, and hard words were the first on their lips in the morning and the first at night. Charles and Hal wrangled whenever Mercedes gave them a chance. It was a cherished belief of each that they did more than his share of his work, and neither forbore to speak his belief at every opportunity. Sometimes Mercedes sided with her husband, sometimes with her brother. The result was a beautiful, unending family quarrel, starting from a dispute as to who would chop a few sticks for fire, a dispute which concerned only Charles and Hal. Presently would be lulled in the rest of the family, fathers, mothers, uncles, cousins, people thousands of miles away, some of them dead. Hal's views on art or any side of society played his brother's rot, should anything have to do with the chopping of a few sticks of firewood, past comprehension. Nevertheless, the quarrel was as likely to end in the direction as the Charles's political prejudices, and Charles's sister, tale-bearing tongue, should be relevant to the building of a Yukon fire, was apparent only to Mercedes, who disburdened herself of copious opinions on that topic, and incidentally upon a few other traits unpleasingly peculiar to her husband's family. In the meantime, the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half-pitched, and the dogs unfed. Mercedes nursed a special grievance, the grievance of sex. She was pretty and soft, and had been chivalrously treated all her days, but the present treatment by her husband and brother was everything upon chivalrous. It was her custom to be helpless. They complained, upon which impeachment it was to her most existential prerogative, it made her lives unendurable. She no longer considered the dogs, because she was sore and tired. She persisted in riding on the sled. She was pretty and soft, but she weighed 120 pounds. Lusty last straw to the load dragged by the weak, starving animals. She rode for days till they fell in the traces and sled stood still. Charles and Hal begged her to get off and walk, pleaded with her, entreated, and she wept in opportune heaven with a recital of her brutality. On one occasion they took her off the sled by main strength. They never did it again. She let her legs go limp like a spoiled child, and sat down on the trail. They went on their way, but she didn't move. After they'd traveled 3 miles, they unloaded the sled, came back for her, and by main strength put her on the sled again. In excess of their own misery, they were callous to the suffering of their animals. Hal's theory, which he practiced on others, was that one must get hardened. He started out preaching it to his sister and brother-in-law. Failing there, he hammered it out into the dogs with a club. At 5 fingers, the dog food gave out, and a toothless old squaw offered to trade them a few pounds of frozen horsehair for the Colt revolver that kept the big hunting knife at Hal's hip. Poor substitute for food was this hide. It had been stripped from starved horses of cattlemen 6 months back. In its frozen state, it was more like strips of galvanized iron, and when a dog wrestled it into his stomach, it thawed into thin, unnutritious leather strings and into a mass of short hair, irritating and indigestible. And through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the team like a nightmare. He pulled when he could, and when he could no longer pull, he fell down and remained till blows from whip or club drove him to his feet again. All the stiffness and gloss has gone out of his beautiful furry coat. The hair hung down, limp and draggled, or matted with the dry blood where Hal's club had bruised him. His muscles had wasted away to knotty strings, and flesh pads had disappeared, so each rib and every bone in his frame were outlined cleanly through the loose hide that had wrinkled in folds of emptiness. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater proved that. And with Buck, so was his mates. They were perambulating skeletons, 7 altogether, including him, In the great misery they'd become insensible to the bite of the lash or bruise of club. The pain of the beating was dull and distant, just as their eyes saw and ears heard things seemed dull and distant. They were not half living, or a quarter living. They were simply bags of bones in which sparks of life fluttered faintly. When a halt was made, they dropped in the traces like dead dogs, and the spark, dimmed and paled, seemed to go out. When the clever whip fell upon them, the spark fluttered feebly up, and they tottered to their feet and staggered on. Then came a day when Billy the good-natured fell and couldn't rise. Hallie had traded his revolver, so he took the axe and knocked Billy on the head as he lay in the traces, then cut out of the carcass the harness and dragged it to one side. Buck saw and his mate saw, and they knew that this was very close to them. On the next day Kuna went, and only 5 remained. Joe, too far gone to be malignant. Pike, crippled and limping, only half conscious and not conscious enough to malinger. Sol Leeks the one-eyed, still faithful to the toil of trace and trail, mournful that he had so little strength with which to pull. Teek, who had not travelled as far that winter, but now been beaten more like the others because he was fresher, and Buck, the head of the team, but no longer enforcing discipline or striving to enforce it, blind with weakness half the time, keeping the trail by the loom of it and the dim feel of his feet. It was a beautiful spring weather, but neither dogs or humans were aware of it. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later. It was dawn at 3 in the morning, and twilight lingered till 9 at night. The whole long day was a blaze of sunshine. Ghostly winter silence had given way to a great spring murmur of awakening life. The murmur arose from all land and fraught with the joy of living, came from the things that had lived and moved again, things which had been dead and not moved during the long months of frost. The sap was rising in the pines. The willows and aspens were bursting out in young buds. Shrubs and vines were putting on fresh garbs of green. Crickets sang in the night, and the days of all manner crawling things rustled forth into the sun. Partridges and woodpeckers were booming and knocking in the forest. Squirrels were chattering, birds singing, and overhead honked the wildfowl, driving from the south into the cunning wedges that split the air. From every hill-slope came the trickle of running water, the music of unseen fountains. All things were thawing, bending, and snapping. The Yukon was straining to break loose the ice that bound it down. It ate away from beneath, the sun ate from above. Air holes formed, fissures sprang and spread apart, while thin sections of ice fell through bodily into the river. Amidst this bursting, rending, throbbing of awakening life under the blazing sun, soft-sighing breezes, wayfarers to death, staggered 2 men, women, and their huskies. With the dogs failing, Mercedes weeping and riding, Hal swearing innocuously, and Charles' eyes wistfully watering, they staggered into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of White River. When they halted, the dogs dropped down as though they'd been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down on a log to rest. He sat down very slowly and painstakingly, with great stillness. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling the last touches on an axe handle he'd made from a stick of birch. He whittled and listened and gave monosyllabic replies, and when it was asked, terse advice. He knew the breed and gave an advice in an uncertainty that it wouldn't be followed. They told us above the bottom was dropping out of the trail, and that's the best thing for us to do is lay over, Hal said in response to Thornton's warning to take no chances on that rotten ice. They told us we wouldn't make White River, and here we are, the last with a sneering ring of triumph in it. And they told you true, John Thornton answered. Bottom's likely to drop out at any moment. Only fools with blind luck of fools could have made it. I tell you straight, I wouldn't risk my carcass on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. That's because you're not a fool, I suppose, said Hal. All the same, we'll go on to Dawson. He uncoiled his whip. Get up there, Buck. Hi, get up. Mush on. Thornton went on whittling. It was idle, he knew, to get between a fool and his folly, or while 2 or 3 fools, more or less, wouldn't alter the scheme of things. But the team didn't get up at the command. It had long since passed into the stage where blows were required to rouse it. The whip flashed out, here and there, on merciless errands. John Thornton compressed his lips. Sol Leeks was the first to crawl to his feet. Teek followed. Joe came next, yelping with pain. Pike made painful efforts. Twice he fell, and half up on the 3rd attempt managed to rise. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he'd fallen. The lash bit into him again and again, but he neither whined nor struggled. Several times Thornton started, as though to speak, but changed his mind. Moisture came to his eyes, and the whipping continued. He arose and walked unresolutely up and down. It was the first time Buck had failed, in itself a sufficient reason to drive Hal to rage. He exchanged the whip for the customary club. Buck refused to move under the rain of heavier blows which now fell upon him. Like his mates, he was barely able to get up, but unlike them, he'd made his mind up not to get up. He had a vague feeling of impending doom. This had been strong enough upon him when he pulled into the bank, and it had not departed him. What of the thin and rotting ice he had felt under his feet all day? It seemed that he sensed disaster close at hand, out there ahead on the ice where his master was trying to drive him. He refused to stir. So great had he suffered, and so far gone was he, that the blows didn't hurt much. They continued to fall upon him. The spark of life within flittered and went down. It was nearly out. He felt strangely numb, as though from a great distance he was aware he was being beaten. The last sensation of pain left him. He no longer felt anything, but very faintly he could hear the impact of the club on his body. But it was no longer his body. It seemed very far away. Then suddenly, without warning, uttering a cry that was inarticulate and more like the cry of an animal, John Horton sprang upon the man who wielded the club. Hal was hurled backward as though struck by a falling tree. Mercedes screamed. Charles looked on wistfully, watering his eyes, but did not get up because of stiffness. John Thornton stood over Buck, struggling to control himself, too convulsed with rage to speak. "If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you," he at last managed to say in a choking voice. "It's my dog," Hal replied, wiping the blood from his mouth as he came back. "Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson." Thornton stood between him and Buck and evinced no intention of getting out of the way. Hal drew his hunting knife. Mercedes screamed, cried, and laughed, and manifested the chaotic abandonment of hysteria. Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with an axe handle, knocked his knife to the ground, rapped his knuckles again as he tried to pick it up. Then he stood, picked it up himself, and with 2 strokes cut Buck's traces. Hal had no fight left in him. Besides, his hands were too full with his sister, or his arms rather, while Buck was too near dead to be of further use in hauling that sled. A few minutes later they pulled out from the bank and down the river. Buck heard them go and raised his head to see. Pike was leading, Solis was at the wheel, and behind him were Joe and Teek. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding a loading sled. Hal guided at the gee-pole, and Charles stumbled along in the rear. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him and with rough, kind hands searched for broken bones. By the time his search had disclosed nothing more than bruises and a state of terrible starvation, the sled was a quarter-mile away. Dog and man watched it crawling along over the ice. Suddenly they saw its back end drop down, as in a rut, and the gee-pole, with Hal clinging to it, jerk into the air. Mercedes' scream came to their ears. They saw Charles turn and make one step to run back, and then a whole section of ice gave way, and dog and humans disappeared. A yawning hole was all that was left to be seen. The bottom dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand.